Okay, so we're on lecture 7, Leuchtenburg's book. This is chapter 9. There. Sorry. Right. Chapter 9. And we've been discussing thus far domestic affairs, but now we're going to shift gears and talk about international affairs. And we're going to go backwards in time a little bit to talk about legislation before Franklin Delano Roosevelt became president. And so we're going to begin with the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928. Kellogg was Secretary of State for the United States. Briand was French Foreign Minister. The act was passed in 1928, and it roughly outlaws war. The signatories agree not to engage in warfare as a way of settling their disputes. On its surface, that sounds fine, right? So pledging not to use warfare, a very good thing. But the problem is that it doesn't have an enforcement mechanism. Or certainly not an enforcement, a useful enforcement mechanism. It largely relies upon people pledging not to engage in war. That's fine as long as nobody does so, but if somebody violates the Kellogg-Briand Pact, there's really no enforcement mechanism to punish them. So as a piece of international diplomacy and an international pact that many nations signed on to, in one ways, it's not particularly important because it doesn't have much effect. It's just words on a paper. So what's the big deal? Well, the problem is the Kellogg-Briand Pact is not just useless words on a paper or idealized sentiments that not everybody is necessarily going to follow. It's that it has real-world impact in the way that nations made their decisions regarding foreign affairs and funding allocations. And so the Kellogg-Briand Pact is this idea that if we can just get rid of war by fiat, then we don't have to be as concerned about all the things you need to spend money on to protect against war. This is not to say that nations stopped their defense budgets, but that this idea permeated through legislative branches around the world, some more or less, and it found a particularly receptive home here in the United States, who with the conclusion of World War I, and as we saw with the 1920 election, the United States consciously rejected a role. We call this isolationism. And this idea of isolationism struck deeply into both the elected officials in Congress, particularly in the Senate, but also was widely held amongst the public. And there are several things that go into this. One is an overriding belief that the U.S. had been tricked into World War I, that the outcome of the war, which cost some amount of American blood and treasure, was something that was regrettable, that the United States shouldn't have been involved, in effect. And the reason that they got involved is that they were fooled, they were tricked. And this idea is validated by some of the more disreputable people in America, historians and journalists. So historians wrote a number of works talking about the propaganda that went in to convince the American public to join the war, how the government under Woodrow Wilson, who had been promoting this idea of making the world safe for democracy, historians said they actually were economic issues behind it. The argument of the historians follows along the line that the United States had lent a lot of money and munitions to the Allies, and they wanted to ensure that they won because they had backed them even during the period that we were officially neutral. In addition, journalists turned up stories about corporations and ammunition makers who made an enormous amount of money during the war, who made enormous amount of money prior to the war, and here in this post-war period, they are still making a lot of money. And so these stories about arms manufacturers and how much money they made were widely reported, and they served to reinforce this idea that the United States had no business in this sordid business of warfare, and that we were better just focusing within our own borders. Here in the United States, this idea of the U.S. being tricked into the war by war profiteers gained some validation when there was a series of committee investigations about the United States their pursuit in the war. And so war profiteers made a lot of money, there's no doubt. And so some of these things turned up what were unsavory stories by the Nye Committee. So an arms manufacturer, two medium to high level executives, their correspondence was uncovered, and they referred to a dispute between Peru and Chile. The Peruvians and the Chileans were arguing over a border, and they were increasing their munitions purchases, including this patrol boat. So Peru bought a patrol boat, and then Chile bought two, and they bought them both from the same company that these executives were part of. And so one executive wrote to another executive because the United States had stepped in to kind of tamp down this ratcheting dispute between the two nations, and had sort of calmed the waters, as it were. And so one executive wrote to another executive saying, it's too bad the United States involved itself diplomatically to slow the tensions between the two states down, because we had a pretty sweet business selling these patrol boats to both sides, right? So as a matter of the activities of company, it's a little disreputable. It is, however, a long way away from suggesting that the United States entered into, or documenting the United States entered into World War I to make arms companies money. But nonetheless, this idea was widespread, and people believed it to be true, especially their elected officials in the United States Congress. So again, widespread beliefs that the United States have been tricked into World War I. That's problematic, but it's not necessarily doesn't have a great impact on what the nation does. Except it does have a great impact on what the nation does, because that impact comes in the form of legislation whose underlying logic is to avoid a repeat of what they saw as this conspiracy, for lack of a better term. And so this legislation comes in the form of something known as cash and carry. Cash and carry legislation, first proposed in 1935, undergoes the Neutrality Acts, of which cash and carry is one of them. Neutrality Act is first passed in 1935, and it undergoes modifications. These neutrality, they're actually acts, plural, because they're changed, one of which is cash and carry, which I'll talk about in a second. So Neutrality Act in 1935 placed an embargo on trade to belligerent nations. So when two nations went to war, the United States said in the Neutrality Act, we're not going to trade with either side. This is directly built on the concept that the United States had been dragged into World War I because they wanted to ensure the Allies won. The Allies had purchased great amounts of equipment from the United States that they had used in the war even prior to the United States declaring war against the Central Powers in World War I. So because British and French ships could show up and purchase materials, and because the British Navy prevented the Germans and Austro-Hungarians from showing up, the United States sold overwhelmingly most of their material to the Allied side. They not only sold them, they sold them on credit. So the theory that the United States gets tricked into the war is that if the Allies didn't win, then these companies would not get paid. So the Allies had to win, which is why the United States entered the war, according to this thinking. So the Neutrality Act is designed to prevent us from getting dragged into this again by placing an embargo. Well, embargo and trade on belligerent nations means pretty much no trade to nations when they go to war, which is not something that manufacturers and farmers want. So the Neutrality Acts are modified to this idea of war materials. Events over the next couple years, one we're going to talk about in just a few moments, the attack by Italy on Ethiopia. So events in the ensuing years led to a modification known as cash and carry. This again is still part of Neutrality Act legislation. Cash and carry says the United States will sell to nations engaged in belligerence on either side, but they have to pay cash on the barrelhead and they have to carry it home themselves. The United States won't be delivering these goods, right? So cash is designed to prevent nations from becoming indebted to the United States for war materials they're purchasing, right? So if you owe a debt and you lose, you end up not paying the debt. So to forestall that aspect, excuse me, forestall that aspect, the United States says you have to pay cash on the barrelhead. And the carry aspect is about how the United States got involved in World War I, because it was German U-boats that were sinking U.S. Ships that led to the public clamor for the U.S. to enter the war. So this legislation is designed to prevent that from happening again. And in effect, these legislations are designed to prevent us from being dragged into World War I again. As we shall see, events in World War II are markedly different than World War I. But nonetheless, this is the logic that is underpinning. It's a reflection of this isolationist thinking that was deeply entrenched in the American public and their representatives in the American Congress. One final piece of legislation that came, that was on the track for potential passage, which would reinforce this notion of isolationism. It's known as the Ludlow Amendment. It's an amendment to the Constitution. And it came first through the Congress, so it has to be ratified by both houses of the Congress before it could be placed before the American public. So the Ludlow Amendment is war by referendum, and here's roughly what it says. Going to war is a major issue, and it's one that the nation as a whole should support. So the Ludlow Amendment says the United States should not go to war unless there is a direct referendum by the public, right? Now, in one way, this sounds like a good idea. The United States should be involved in warfare with the full support and backing of the American public, and what better way to do so than to take a vote? But it ignores the reality of the way relations between nations occur. If the president is in a dispute with a foreign state and says, don't push me too far, or I'm going to craft a special legislation that's going to pass before the American public, and then when I get that support from them, we're going to show you, this is a very cumbersome process, right? So you have to craft a legislation that is going to go before the American public in a special plebiscite that has to be organized. Ballots have to be printed up. They have to have an election. They have to count up the ballots. And then once you have that support in hand, then the president can go back and say, see, I told you you're in trouble, right? So as an effective tool of diplomacy, it's non-existent. And when the president or any elected official has to deal with other states, they have to have credible threats of force, right? This is not a credible threat if the president has to go through this cumbersome process every time he has to have support for using military action. The Ludlow Amendment, because it's a constitutional amendment, would have to change what's in the Constitution, right? So the Constitution, the Founding Fathers laid out the war powers, which in order to offer some form of protection, they split them between the legislative and the executive branch. The president is authorized as commander-in-chief to use military powers in an emergency, and only the legislative branch, the Congress, can vote the United States to go to war, right? So those things were developed by the Founding Fathers. The Ludlow Amendment is going to change it. Also, because Franklin Delano Roosevelt is a very shrewd politician, he knows something about the populace, things like my mother. Right, so my mother is never going to vote to send her sons to war. I have a brother who's a jarhead. Even as a jarhead, she would not vote for him to go to war. So in a special election, it's going to have to overcome the resistance by people like my mother, is not going to vote to send her sons to war. This Ludlow Amendment was very popular in the Senate, so it was sure to pass the Senate, which is deeply isolationist. The battleground, I suppose, is going to be in the House. And so Franklin Delano Roosevelt employed all the tools and tricks that he had available. He used persuasion, he used threats, he used extortion, he used promises, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt has a lot of political power. He was successfully able to convince enough House members to vote against it, because it seems likely, judging by polling and understanding of the American public at that time in their isolationist thinking, that if it had passed the House, it probably was going to pass in a national referendum and be a constitutional amendment changing the way the nation dealt with its war power. So in the House, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, through all these various tools and tricks, was able to prevent its passage. It failed 209 to 188. Very close vote nonetheless, but it's indicative of this sort of sentiment that is widely held in the public and also widely held in the Congress. So this period of the Great Depression, it's a lot of issues are going on. And one of the things is that this is a global depression, not just a national disaster. And so you have different forms of government who are dealing with this disaster, this global disaster of this Great Depression in different ways. And so at some level, there's a competition between varieties of ways of governments and the way people have organized themselves in the governments and how they interact. And so you have a series of states that are fascist states that eventually become linked together, right, as the Axis. But at the time, they were loosely aligned. So these Axis powers are fascist states. Fascism is a particular way of governing that has a strong dictator, and the state directs business and controls all aspects of civic life, including business, right? So it's not socialism in which the state owns them, because these private corporations are profit-making, but they're the fascist central government has a strong power over what they can do. So during this time frame of the Great Depression, these fascist states begin to recover. They are doing better in the economic disaster of the Great Depression than liberal democracies are. So thinking about how one set of states responds, it seems to indicate that this fascist state or fascist organization of government is superior in the crisis of the Great Depression than liberal democracies. In retrospect, we can see why these fascist states do better economically than liberal democracies do. And it's because these states, these governments are busily rearming, right? They are investing in the production, mass production of material for warfare. The state is spending great sums of money to do so. This is stimulating the economy. Factories are put to work making howitzers or tanks or aircraft. So the state is spending money to put these factories to the business of making these things, investing in it. This sops up the number of unemployed, as well as the fact that these tools of the trade are to be used by an expanded military. So things that are useful for lowering your unemployed rate is to sop up some of those unemployed folks and put them in khaki, put them in the military, right? So in retrospect, we can see that this greatly expanded budget for purchasing war materials is something that was ginning up the recovery for these fascist states. They were amassing a large debt, but these fascist powers have an idea of how they're going to fix their debt. the way they're going to resolve the emerging debt issues is sort of distinctive to this fascist idea. They're going to take other people's stuff. So a fascist state is not just expanding to be more powerful so that it's more powerful. The intent is to become more powerful so then you can begin to dominate your neighbors, right? In retrospect, building up a lot of debt with the expectation you're going to steal somebody else's stuff to make your economy whole is what is allowing these states to recover. But at the time, that was not clear. So some folks are beginning to say, you know, this is disaster, this economic disaster, is something that liberal democracies can't handle, that the market capitalist system can't fix, that it requires a dictatorial system like a fascist state. So there are people who are attracted to the notion. And it is during this time, the Great Depression, that these fascist states, what becomes the Axis later, right, but then known as, you know, they weren't formally known as the Axis, these states are beginning to expand. And the first place it occurs, this fascist expansion, is the Japanese in Manchuria. The Japanese were an emerging industrial empire. They had constructed a modern industrial based military. They were remaking their economy to be a modern industrial producing sector. And modern industrial states and states that provide armaments for the military require certain things. They require lots of steel, right? Steel is a key component of this sort of construction. They need petroleum products. They need other raw materials. Japan has many things on its island, but it lacks some of these core components of the industrial economy, such as large-scale access to iron ore and petroleum. So the Japanese, seeking to expand, right, because every fascist state believes that its glory resides in expansion to other folks for the greater elevation of the state, right? So the Japanese are looking to acquire these things, and as they cast their covetous eyes about, they see in China, particularly a region known as Manchuria, a place that's chock full of many of the things the Japanese need to fuel their industrial expansion. So the Japanese invade Manchuria with the intent of stealing this from China and preventing the Russians from stealing it as well, the Soviets at that time, right? And to gather the materials for the greater Japanese empire, which is what they do. Now, this is clearly a violation of the Kellogg-Briand Pact. It's clearly a violation of the ideas of the League of Nations. So the the Japanese engage in this effort, and there's gonna be some sort of penalty for this, they think, right? How big it is or how bad it is unclear, but weighing the two things, they decide that they need these raw materials more than whatever the fallout's going to be from seizing part of another state. And so the Japanese grab Manchuria and wait to see what happens. Not much happens, right? There's some paper waving about the Kellogg-Briand Pact. There's some strong words from the League of Nations, but there's really very little impact. The United States doesn't even end or put a hold on trade with the Japanese because Franklin Delano Roosevelt's administration says, we need all the trade we can get, so we're not going to cut off any trade. So there's a lot of harsh words, but there's no real impact for the Japanese. They're not punished for this violation of international peace. Another fascist state that begins to expand is Italy. Italy, under Benito Mussolini, wants to create a more powerful Italian state. Mussolini thinks that any good empire needs more stuff in order to be more powerful, right? So as they look around, all the stuff has been taken. And so they cast their eyes to the south, to the continent of Africa, which has also been largely carved up between European colonial powers. But there's one state that hasn't been claimed by European powers. So Italy says, concocts some sort of long-running dispute with the independent state of Ethiopia. So Italy decides they're going to punish the Ethiopians, as they state it, but it's more about creating a new Roman Empire, as Mussolini refers to it. So they invade Ethiopia. Italy is a modern industrial state with a modern industrial army, aircraft, tanks, ships, right? And so they invade Ethiopia, and Ethiopia does not have a modern industrial military. So the Italians are assaulting Ethiopia. This is clearly a violation of their international rights. And it's clearly an unprovoked attack between states, so some condemnation is in order. And the United States is kind of stuck in a bad spot because they're not a member of the League of Nations. So the League of Nations imposes an oil embargo on Italy to punish them that lasts for a couple of months, right? The United States, not part of the League of Nations, is kind of stuck, and the Ethiopians are requesting assistance, but because the United States has passed this Neutrality Act, they can't help them. So in Congress, they modify the Neutrality Act that says you can't help any belligerent, and so the United States says we'll help the Ethiopians, if they want to come purchase these goods, but Ethiopia can't come across the ocean to purchase these goods to take them back. So cash and carry doesn't help them much at all, really. And so the United States wags their fingers, says some harsh words, and joins the embargo for a short period of time. But again, Italy's not severely punished for this effort, right? So the expansion of fascist states is occurring and it's not being punished. The third fascist state that's beginning to recover is Germany. And the German expansion, more so than Italy and Japan, is largely overcoming sort of the punishing aspects of the Versailles Treaty that concluded World War I. So as we recall back to the Versailles Treaty, the Allies imposed on the Germans a number of penalties, including the size of the military, how much equipment they could have, the size of their navy. So all those things were part of the Versailles Treaty. Included in that was also the fact that the Germans had to pay what were known as reparations, which were the costs of the war. And so this reparation debt was enormous and crushing. And the German state could not pay that. They fell behind on their payments. So the French, in order to force the Germans to honor this repayment schedule, and also in the meantime to take this repayment in kind rather than in cash, occupied the Ruhr Valley. The Ruhr Valley is the industrial heartland, the production center of the German state. It would be what we refer to today as the Rust Belt, which used to be the industrial manufacturing belt of the United States, let's say from Pittsburgh to Chicago. The Ruhr Valley is comparable to that. It's full of iron mines, it's full of steel works, it's full of manufacturing. This is the industrial heartland of Germany, and the French occupied it. And when they occupied it with the intent of extracting wealth from it, and also to punish the German people, right? So let's talk about the punishment. The French purposely used what they called their colonial forces to occupy the Ruhr. These are ethnic minorities from their empire. These colonial forces the French were using that to rub a little salt in the wounds of the Germans by saying, we don't even need our best troops to occupy this area. We're just going to use these colonial forces. And also it exacerbated these sort of chauvinistic and racially limited views of the German population because, as soldiers are wont to do, they were associating with the people in the region. So this was a double insult to the Germans, right? So that the French colonial forces are not their best forces, and they're also dating German women, and these were things that were insulting to the German pride. And the French were occupying these territories in order to extract what they were producing in lieu of the payments the Germans weren't making. So this is something that is not part of the Versailles Treaty. The Versailles Treaty did not turn the Ruhr Valley over to France. The Ruhr Valley is part of Germany, unlike the region known as Alsace and Lorraine, which was also part of the Versailles Treaty. Alsace and Lorraine historically has a strong French component, and the Germans had only stolen Alsace and Lorraine from France as a result of the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, right? So when the French, as part of the Versailles Treaty, took back Alsace and Lorraine, these are regions that had a lot of ethnic French as well as some ethnic Germans. So, and it had formerly been part of the French Empire or kingdom, I suppose. That's not the case with the Ruhr Valley. The Ruhr Valley is German. It's full of German speakers, ethnic Germans. There aren't any French there, and it was clearly a punishment that the French were extracting. So the new German leader, who's talking about a greater German state, is a fellow by the name of Adolf Hitler. And Hitler knows that for his dreams, he's going to have industrial production, which means he has to take the Ruhr Valley back. Also, this will help restore German pride, which is also a component of this fascist ideal, right? The idea of fascism is that we are the greatest people and all these other people are inferior. So the greatest people need to have a great state that reflects their greatness. So the fascist thinking goes. So Hitler wants to recreate or create a greater German state. And so in order to do that, he's going to need to build up the military, which means he's going to need the Ruhr, plus the fact that the French are insulting the German people every day by occupying the Ruhr. So Hitler decides he's going to take the Ruhr back. Now, as part of the Versailles Treaty, the German military is small and poorly equipped, and every German leader, military leader, says this is a crazy idea. The French will punish us, right? And we can't stop them. But Hitler plunges on nonetheless. And so under his direction, the German military marches into the Ruhr Valley to take it back. And the French give it back. Now, there's two parts. So one, clearly the French understood that the Ruhr Valley is part of Germany, right? And so in order for them to pay us back, they're going to have to be able to manufacture stuff, and that's part of it. But the bigger part of it is neither the French nor the British were willing to go to war over this. They were still reeling from the effects of World War I, and they said, is this really worth going to war over? And they decided no. So triumphantly, the Germans retake the war, raising the profile of Adolf Hitler and his party. And then the production of the Ruhr Valley is turned to making the German state better. Hitler says he's reoccupying the Ruhr in order to protect these ethnic minority Germans, or the German people who are being mistreated by these foreign enemies, right? Once he reoccupies the Ruhr as the elevation of the state, he begins to unleash his plans for removing or limiting what he sees as the not pure Germans. And so this is, in the wake of this reoccupying of the Ruhr, is the passage of anti-Semitic legislation, which is designed to separate out people that Hitler considered not part of the German state. Now, the fourth power I want to talk about in this fascist expansion is in Spain, right? The Spanish Civil War broke out between the rightists, who were fascists, led by Generalissimo Franco. And the leftists were radicals and liberals and socialists who wanted to oppose this sort of dictatorial state. So this civil war, as it's referred, as the term suggests, it's an internal war between these two wings of Spanish society. But it's not just a civil war. It's a civil war that serves as sort of this proxy for conflict between the rightists, who are fascists, and the leftists, who are radicals, communists, and socialists. So this struggle plays out in Spain sort of as a stand-in for a larger struggle that's going on in Europe and around the world. The leftists have some support from the Soviets, right, who are delivering munitions and some money, and they also have some support from the French, who are French radicals are also supporting. They also attract leftists from around the world. Leftists from the United States joined in this civil war. They created what was known as the Abraham Lincoln Brigade to fight in this conflict in Spain, supporting this global socialist ideal against the fascist state. So this is where the battleground is, and some of these folks came to it, including a little writer by the name of Ernest Hemingway. The rightists, the fascist, Franco received more extensive support from other fascist states, primarily Germany and Italy, right, who funneled large amounts of money and equipment to support Franco in this civil war. And for the Germans, even more than just delivering money and munitions, the Germans actually flew air cover for Spanish forces. So German pilots were fighting in the civil war over Spain on the side of Franco. The Germans were taking the opportunity to get their pilots some practice in what they were developing as a new type of warfare, in which aircraft would serve as forward air support for rapid movement of troops. So the German pilots actually were flying in the Civil War fighting the leftists, right? All four of these Axis states are states that are expanding, and they're fascist states. They're not Axis yet. They formed on the eve of World War II is when they formed this alliance known as the Axis. But these are fascist states who are seeking to expand. They're reinforcing one another, and they're trying out expansionistic tactics that are challenging states around the globe. Okay, so that's where we are for lecture 7, and we will pick up next time by shifting back to the domestic sphere.